Hi, my name is, or was, that depends, Eric Labernich. I don't know what time or date it is. I think it's 2075 now, but I was born in 2023 in Germany, and I'm now around 52 years old. So I'm a German, but I don't think there are much Germans left to see this. This is why I do this recording in English, because English was one of the most spoken languages in the world. The chances are much higher that whoever sees this in the future will speak English instead of German. However, all countries, including the English-speaking ones, got extremely depopulated, if not wiped out. So the chances are high that no one ever will see this. Oh, and if you see this, please excuse any mistakes and mispronunciations. English is not my mother language. I found this almost ancient looking Nokia camera a minute ago in this old rotten tiny, what is it, train wagon, and was very surprised that it's still charged, because electricity went off about almost a decade ago. However, since I have the opportunity now, I just decided to leave this message for you. Well, how to begin? I really don't know how many humans are still alive worldwide, but the number is low. I personally think we shrink to maybe 500,000 conscious souls worldwide. Just for you to understand, when I was born in 2023, the number of all people worldwide were about 8 billion. I'm not sure if the things I'll tell you now affected native people who still live like our ancestors thousands of years ago in rainforests or deserts. I don't think so, but for sure all industrialized countries were massively affected, if not wiped out. It all might have begun with the Roswell incident in the USA in 1947, so about 130 years ago, because after that incident we as humans made huge progresses with electronic devices, which was the beginning from our end. I mean, first it was very good. We got a lot of economic growth and wealth and sneaky gadgets like this camera and whatnot. But it really started to get kind out of control around 1990, I say. This was a time when people got more and more used to use computers. But over time, this made them much weaker, because they were sitting around all the time. They lost muscle mass and eyesight from staring at the screens all the time, and they began to get ill much faster when they went out. So they stayed at home much more to prevent illnesses, and went to the doctors much more to take medicines against this and that all the time, which made them even more ill, weaker, and addicted to medications. However, over the next decades, computers and everything got more advanced, and then so-called flat screens were invented, which pinned people in front of them even more. This was done by using special waves or frequencies or heart rates or whatever those things emitted. I don't know the correct English name for that. But for sure, it kind of hypnotized the people and made them dull. The governments already had experimented way before 1990 with a lot of different waves and frequencies which were affecting people in one way or another. The US operation MK Ultra, for example, ran such things already in the 1950s, which came to light around the year I was born. There were waves to make people puke or poop, or even willing to kill themselves. But also there were waves, the softer ones, who could make people sleepy, happy, or sad, or dull. However, around the year 2000, almost all people got used to have computers at home and small computers in their pockets, called smartphones, which were also able to access the worldwide internet, and with it, all the knowledge of the world. But instead of getting smarter, people only were sitting around alone even more. A lot of them swiped mindlessly through internet platforms like TikTok or YouTube, if you know them, watching dumb shit like the Tide Pod Challenge, which was basically eating washing powder, or were playing one of the millions of available computer games, or worse, were watching those so-called Let's Plays, where people could watch other people playing those computer games instead of playing those games themselves. People wasted away while watching willingless advertisements, millions of advertisements, and stupid crap all the time on their smartphones and flat screens. We humans got dumber by the hour and were distancing and isolating ourselves more and more, and people got weaker and weaker by the year, and also a lot of us slowly lost the ability to think for themselves, because now algorithms and AIs did it for us. However, it must have been around the year 2010 when the first zombies were spotted. Zombies were basically people who were staring at their smartphones all the time, and they behaved a lot like zombies from horror movies when they were walking, hence the name zombie, but I'll come to that later. So the people lost more and more the ability to talk proper, to read and write, and to socialize. Everyone was just sitting alone while having thousands of online friends he never welcomed in his home. Therefore, less and less birth happened in countries who had these technologies. All this was the result from the dulling waves, or what you would call it, the electronics emitted, because they kept the people sitting alone, glued to screens. They were interested in anything else anymore, not even in the most popular activity since mankind came into existence, I mean, sex. These are different reasons, and all of them were implanted from the so-called social media, like having fun was the main goal in life, or preferring so-called career just to get expensive status things like luxury cars or designer clothes, instead of having loving children and a loving family. The real fulfillment of a human life got replaced by false fulfillments. But it got even worse. Movements of people came up who demanded that humans should have no babies anymore, because suddenly it was claimed that babies produced a lot of CO2, that's gas, in case you don't know, which was said to harm the environment and support climate change, which would cost us our lives. Before the babies, the people blamed farting cows and other animals for the CO2 emissions, but now our own babies were one of the most feared CO2 polluters and climate killers, and the people really believed it, so people started to prevent birth because of fear of CO2 and climate warming. But at the same time, people demanded more and more goods like electric cars and more meat and whatnot. Those productions produced so much more CO2. However, this is why people started to allow abortions up to the last month, and then started to euthanize the old and sick people just to prevent them from breathing out the horrible CO2 gas. But it got even worse. Then the poorer countries, so-called second and third world countries, which still had good birth rates and so far healthy but undereducated people, got entangled in wars, the third world, like the USSR had started. And then a vast majority of the citizens of said countries were moved to first world countries like France, Germany and Sweden, just to name a few. I remember that when I was a child there were some religious clashes here and there because these undereducated people were very religious, but it took just a few years to silence them as well. You see, those people's brains also got numbed by the waves all these electric devices emitted, because now everyone had to have a mobile phone or a computer, and with that flat and touch screens they were everywhere and almost unavoidable. So almost everyone got affected without realizing it. You know, I would compare this effect to an alcoholic who drank every day and stated that everything is okay with him and he's normal like always, but an outstander would have noticed that this is not the case, because the alcoholic would slowly change in behavior and many other things due to his alcohol consumption. And with that, the people got dumber, more entitled, even more ignorant and much more duller from day to day. An example is that people even fought for and over money they never had. The money the people had before 2030 were coins and banknotes, and they were pretty worthless themselves, but they believed in the 50 or the 10 which was printed on it, and at least you had something in your hand physically, you know. But in 2030 the governments got rid of physical money, and now citizens use plastic cards and their smartphones to pay and get paid. Some even got so-called RFID chips implanted, which allowed them to pay with a swipe with their wrists, you know. However, now with just numbers in a computer somewhere, there was nothing physical the people could grab and nothing of real value at all. But so many of us fought for these numbers with their lives. But it got even worse. It started a couple of years before I was born, I think. Suddenly, more and more people got confused what sex they were. After existing for at least 250,000 years, the humans suddenly couldn't tell anymore the difference between male and female. First hundreds, then thousands of so-called genders popped up, and people got used to love their own sexes or no sexes at all. That meant even less offsprings. However, other people suddenly thought there were animals like wolves, cats or foxes, or not from this world at all. They made up some new pronouns like seer or xem and expected everyone else to use them. People also started to love trees or sex dolls or the Eiffel Tower or any other material thing, but no other human anymore. Females were fighting males, accusing them to be mansplaining all the time or to fight for some far-fetched patriarchy, while men got kind of, you know, made gay, not interested in women anymore. Overall, men were no longer seen as the head of the family, but rather a lesser life form, which had nothing else in mind than raping women all the time, which more and more men, on the other hand, dreamed to be a woman or dreamed about fucking other men's asses. You see, when I was born in 2023, it was still okay to give birth as a hetero couple. But a few years later, around 2030, it wasn't anymore. If a woman gave birth to a baby without permission, she ended up in prison and the child in government foster care. If there was a father, he got arrested too. And both had to pay for the so-called care with labor work, but never got to see their child again. Governments introduced harsh birth control policies because of overpopulation, even if they knew already that at this point that it was predicted that the population of humans would start to decline by 2050 because of overaging and much too less birth, you know. However, any couple who legally wanted to have a baby first needed to be allowed to have one, and then they got a DNA modified lab grown one. This should have helped to prevent diseases like cancer and give the parents exactly the baby they wanted, for example with blue eyes and a high IQ, but we later found out, when it already was too late, that the human race got fooled by the scientists. It turned out that all of those modified offsprings were infertile, and a lot of them went crazy later in life. So it was really horrible, but it got even worse. You wouldn't believe. Now children who already had parents which were both men or women or identified themselves, for example, as dogs, got taught the so-called gender equality in kindergartens and schools and learned from so-called drag queens, which were basically men overdressed as women, how cool it was to be gay. That resulted in offsprings so confused that they never could find out what sex they were. You know, boys were made girls and vice versa, and to love the same sex, to have sex with, suddenly was kind of normal. For example, and to women attracted men, not wanting having sex with another man who identified as a woman made the man some kind of racist, a Nazi, and whatnot. It was said they were very bad people because they were not inclusive enough and homophobe and whatnot. You know, when I look back what happened to us, it always reminds me of this story from the Bible, Sodom and Gomorrah. You know, in this tale the people got wiped out by God because of their sins. Maybe it was Sodom and Gomorrah we lived in, and we got wiped out again because of that same behavior. It could be because nobody read the Bible anymore and was exact the same scenario, full of sins and non-believers. I mean, I don't believe in God too, but speaking about the Bible and sins, people for hundreds of years had the tradition to have Christmas trees for Christmas, which was the birthday of God's Son, Jesus. I mention this because a lot of people already had forgotten about God's Son when everything ended. For the most people, only Santa Claus existed, which brought presents at Christmas Eve. Santa Claus was a figure which was invented by the Coca-Cola company around 1900s to increase the consumption of Coca-Cola. But in the end, Santa Claus increased the consumption of everything, and Christmas became a pure consumption event. However, around 2024, people started to erect huge anal plugs instead of Christmas trees. The first one was erected in Paris, France. They said those are modern art Christmas trees, but they looked no different to butt plugs. The first one in France was torn down a few weeks later by some activists, but in the following years the so-called LGBTQ community erected so many from them everywhere that they became normal. So it happened that over time those anal plug Christmas trees became the new Christmas trees and helped to sell much more butt plugs than ever. Even kids got their own little buddies from Santa, little buddies, which was of course the kids' parents. But despite all the sex offers and butt plugs everywhere, humans were dying out. All the wars we fought over the years decimated us massively, and the ones which were left after the last Great War against everything and everybody were, beside the infertile DNA-modified humans, either too old to reproduce or already chemically castrated. You know, back in the days, people accepted bio foods as the better food and were willing to pay much more for it. But before all the bad foods were invented by companies to gain more profits, there were only bio foods on everyone's table, until they were replaced with non-bio foods for the majority. These non-bio foods made people sick over decades. They got all sorts from illnesses from it, like fat liver or cancer, and overall it reduced the sperm production in men and egg production in women. But because it was spiked with ingredients like glutamate and sugar, which made the people kind of like addicted, they ate it all the time and got fat and gravely ill. But instead of changing for the better, people started to promote having no kids because of a bad future. Other obese people started the fat positivity movement, even if everybody should have known that to have a massive overweight or no children at all is far from a healthy society. Oh, and not to forget the time between 2020 and 2022. In this time, people were scared to death with reports from the so-called corona pandemic. Governments told their citizens that millions of people could die from it, and everybody was horrified. But then so-called mRNA vaccines came out very quickly and people rushed to get them in hopes not to die. For those who didn't rush to get the vaccinations because they were skeptic because of how quickly the nanotechnology based vaccines were invented and that they never had been used before, there was a kind of suppression which took place in those years. The skeptics were threatened with losing their jobs and whatnot, and many bowed down from the months-long pressure and finally took the vaccines. But then, suddenly, it seemed like people who got the jabs died in greater numbers, like people had died from the pandemic. Also, suddenly, a lot of women couldn't get pregnant anymore or had miscarriages, and a lot of people got weird illnesses like turbo cancer or sudden heart attacks and whatnot. My mother was one of the few who did not bow under the pressure of the first corona vaccination wave, because back then she was deep into the so-called threat housewife movement, which basically meant that she was just a traditional housewife like back in the 1800s, whose sole job the family was. The threat wife movement was seen as crazy by other women, like, why didn't she want a career, right? And a lot of money and thousands of sex partners for fun, instead of just one lame husband for life and crying, pooping, and this horrible CO2 gas emitting baby. But because she was at home all the time and had no employer, she kinda slipped under the radar with me. This is why I was born a healthy baby and stayed a healthy baby, because my birth was not submitted to the government, so it had no clue that I existed. However, my parents finally had to bow down to a now for everyone mandatory mRNA vaccination when a second pandemic wave was announced in 2029. Again, a lot of people died after this, and sadly about half a year later my father died from a heart attack and my mother lost my unborn sibling, probably as a result of the forced vaccination. So I stayed a secret single child. Because I was a single child, I never visited a kindergarten or school, never got any vaccines, and also never watched TV or played computer games when I was young. My parents had me at home and we had no PC, TV or console, which was not only rare, but almost unheard of in the 30s. I got homeschooled by my mother and she taught me to be an outdoorsman and how to survive in the wild, until she also passed away in 2042. But as you can see, thanks to her education, I'm still well fed, while other people starved to death a long time ago. This is because I know where to find food outdoors and others did not. They never learned about edible wild plants or how to trap and process animals or how to start a fire. They just learned useless crap like religions and names of long dead politicians and how many made up genders there were. However, let me summarize the events I just told you about real quick. Starting in the 1990s, people got weaker and more isolated and dull by just sitting around all the time. About a decade later, it got much worse with the introduction of smartphones and flat screens emitting these dull-making waves. People refused to reproduce. More and more went gay, and more men went gay, and women went lesbian. A lot of those who went not gay or lesbian and could have reproduced were either confused and thought they were animals like cats or foxes, or had no sex drive at all, or were made ill or infertile by processed industrial foods full of chemicals like aspartame. And then those repeatedly on people forced mRNA vaccinations, which surprisingly also interfered with the wave smartphones and flat screens emitted, made the people even further into ill and almost willingless robots. The last ones, which could have saved the human race by starting a new population in peace, massacred themselves in the last Great War from 2062 to 2066. Yeah, May the 16th, 2066 is the date when our so-called civilization finally came to an end. On this day, we humans had finally started to throw atomic bombs on ourselves. But this was still not the worst. Much worse was that shortly after that, atomic reactors started to melt due to nobody left to maintain them, which caused massive contamination of vast parts of the land around the reactors due to deadly radioactivity. When there suddenly nobody was left to maintain things, I'll explain why. Why there was nobody. Why there suddenly nobody was left to maintain things, I'll explain in a minute. But first, I'll explain why I'm still wandering around in this empty Germany. Germany was lucky, so to say, because in contrary to, for example, France, which had many atomic power plants, Germany had not a single one. Because Germany got rid of all atomic power plants back in 2020 or around that time. This had caused massive electricity problems for decades. But now it turned out to be a good thing, because the land is nowhere contaminated. As you may know, atomic contamination can last up to 380,000 years, so I feel really bad for France and other countries which had atomic reactors. The land will be uninhabitable for a long time, and that's why I don't go there. However, the few supermarkets and shops which still sold something up to May 2066 suddenly were just deserted like everything else, and then the electricity went out. And when the electricity went out, all hope was lost, because the very few surviving humans even couldn't start a fire anymore. You know, there was a time where humans had thought that we would become godlike creatures like We were able to clone animals, fruits, and even our own babies and live for 300 years and whatnot. But then, after the war, a lot of the very few remaining people were absolutely helpless. For example, they couldn't process meat anymore. They never had done it before. All the meat they ever ate, they bought in supermarkets or restaurants. So they had no idea what to do. Often they even failed in catching animals because they were not able to trap them. But if someone catched and butchered something, a lot of people ate their fish and meat raw. And with that they got parasites like tapeworms and nematodes, which they died from as well, because there were no doctors, no medicine, and no knowledge about this left. Simple. I mean, in the past people had books, but they all got replaced with correctly gendered online books. But since there was no electricity and no internet anymore, there was no knowledge anymore. Also, the majority of the remaining people were vegetarians and vegans since decades, because people got the idea implanted to avoid meat because of the CO2 farting cows I already mentioned. So eating meat got almost completely replaced by eating insects like mealworms and crickets after 2035, and meat was only available to the richest. So the people almost forget about it. Another huge problem was that after the war, the few remaining people just couldn't grow their own vegetables and crops anymore, because everything was DNA modified since decades from companies like Monsanto. To have and to grow not modified vegetables and crops, scheiße, Mann. Kurzer Freeze wegen dem Flugzeug. Ich muss nochmal von vorne anfangen, aber nicht ganz von vorne. Ich gehe wieder zurück, and when the electricity went out. Ich hoffe, du hörst mich. Ich gehe wieder zurück zu and when the electricity went out. And when the electricity went out, all hope was lost, because the very few surviving humans even couldn't start a fire anymore. You know, there was a time where humans had thought that we would become godlike creatures, able to clone animals, fruits, and even our own babies, and live for 300 years and whatnot. But then, after the war, a lot of the very few remaining people were absolutely helpless. For example, they couldn't process meat anymore. They never had done it before. All the meat they ever ate, they bought in supermarkets or restaurants, so they had no idea what to do. Often they even failed in catching animals because they were not able to trap them. But if someone catched and butchered something, a lot of people ate their fish and meat raw, and with that they got parasites like tapeworms and nematodes, which they died from as well, because there were no doctors, no medicine, and no knowledge about this left. I mean, in the past, the people had books, but they all got replaced with correctly gendered online books. But since there was no electricity and no internet anymore, there was no knowledge anymore. Also, the majority of the remaining people were vegetarians and vegans since decades, because people got the idea implanted to avoid meat because of the CO2 farting cows I already mentioned. So eating meat got almost completely replaced by eating insects like tapeworms, eating insects like mealworms and crickets after 2035, and meat was only available to the richest. so the people almost forgot about it. Another huge problem was that after the war, the few remaining people just couldn't grow their own vegetables and crops anymore because everything was DNA modified since decades from companies like Monsanto. To have and to grow not modified vegetables and crops was made illegal, I think already 2 decades before I was born. But because my parents were such freaks and had inherited real seeds from their parents, which they had from their parents and so on, I grew up with real vegetables and still carry their seeds with me. But all the other people who did gardening as a hobby depended on buying all their seeds from those companies. But when everything broke down after the last Great War, there were no seeds anymore to buy and to plant. Of course, first people planted the still available seeds, but those seeds didn't make new seeds because of the DNA modifications. So this explains why so many people starved to death after 2066. Not to mention all the other problems people got killed by. Another example is that since a lot of people were on medicines like antibiotics their whole life, but after 2066 not anymore, they got ill real quick and died fast because their bodies had no own immune system. And all of a sudden, there were no people walking around anymore. You see, when I say no people, then I mean no rational thinking people like me. Because from time to time, I still stumble over one of the already mentioned zombies. But while the very first zombies were just people who were heavily distracted by their phones and then running into things, the zombies nowadays are really brain dead and are looking at phones which are out of service since almost a decade. Freeze, Mucke. Oh Mann, Alter. Weiter geht's. This is because people began to implant so-called Neuralink chips into their brains around the year 2025. And by 2060, almost everyone had them installed. Even kids from the age of 6 got them. They were invented in 2019 and the first person got this implant in 2023, the year when I was born. Those chips made humans able to communicate with computers directly, which was a huge success, and outdated RFID chips because humans were now able to communicate with computers by thinking. But I think not a single implantee thought that computers could take over human brains as well someday. But that's exactly what happened. Just one day after humans started to throw atomic bombs on themselves, the Neuralink chips suddenly took over all those people's minds at once and made them into willingless zombies. I don't know if this was a kind of short circuit or something, but that's why suddenly nobody was left to maintain things. I think the zombies are trapped in some kind of virtual world. You know, they behave like remote controlled and survive somehow. They eat whatever they can find, mostly corpses from dead birds or other animals they stumble upon. But basically, they eat everything what's edible and they can get their hands on. And yes, they also would try to eat me. They are dangerous man-eaters, right? But interestingly, they don't eat each other. Although they don't eat each other. They seem to recognize their kind somehow, and I'm sure it has something to do with the Neuralink implants. Once a zombie senses me, it will come run towards me and will demand extremely aggressive, either a mobile charger or a password. And if you don't give it instantly to them, and I mean really instantly, like in 1 second, you know, they'll try to kill you in their raging madness. I think this behavior could be a rest of the egoistic entitlement the people had developed over the decades until the end. I was wandering alone for a couple of years, and I already thought I am the last normal thinking person on earth. But then I met another wanderer in, I think it was in 2069, I guess, and I was so happy, and so was he. We hadn't seen conscious humans since years. His name was Gernot Sabelnick, and he was a kind of a lucky dude, because he had the Neuralink chip implanted and all vaccinations given, but got everything removed due to a hefty work accident which crushed his skull and led to heavy blood loss. So when the doctors started to fix him, the destroyed chip got removed and he got yet unvaccinated synthetic blood conserves. He just had recovered from his hefty injuries and already had an appointment to reinstall the new chip when everything broke down. So he was spared the life and death of a zombie. However, one day, a couple of months ago, while he was dumping his shit in a ditch behind a bush, he got strangulated by a zombie with a phone charger. When the zombie found out he demanded password he had given didn't work. I heard the struggle, of course, and came to help him. And of course, I killed the zombie, but it was already too late for Gernot. His windpipe was crushed, and he died in my arms with an unwiped ass, you know. But how horrible it was until now. The most horrible thing is that everything that had happened seems to be orchestrated by aliens. Since we humans are gone, I see them flying around very often in objects the people called UFOs back in the days, and they are the ones who keep the zombies alive to harvest them one day. I believe that the aliens came to our planet not to fight us, but latest after they crash landed in Roswell and we killed and tortured them and experimented on them and ripped them off of their technologies, which we never fully understood, they used exactly this technology against us to wipe us from the planet, to conquer it for themselves. That's at least what I think, you know. In the beginning, the aliens were able to get us on their side, obviously luring a lot of us in with promises of might and wealth and much better and longer life, and of course people wanted that, so they helped the aliens unknowingly to get rid of their own species by introducing all that fancy stuff like bad foods, flat screens, smartphones, RFID and brain chips, and nanotechnology like mRNA, as well as AI tech and whatnot. Have you ever heard from humans sacrificing other humans? A lot of tribes did that in ancient times. Most known for this were the Aztecs and the Mayas from South America. They sacrificed to the gods and dumped the sacrifices into water. Did they do it for the aliens from whom they believed were gods to keep them calm? It could be, because the aliens live under the sea where we never can reach them, and now they are the new rulers of this planet. However, I never saw an alien in my life. Also, I don't know where they came from, or how they look like, or how they call themselves. This is still a mystery. All I know is that they are still here. The aliens can't live on the land, it seems. I think they can't get out because they need another pressure than humans to survive. You see, we humans wanted to colonize planet Mars for a long time, but we didn't do it because we would have faced the same problems as the aliens. The pressure on Mars is just not right for us, and we would have died immediately when we had tried to wander unprotected over the surface of the red planet. However, what I know is that their machines have the ability to paralyze humans instantly or to even pulverize them at the spot. But I think they don't do it anymore. I mean, they could have done it with me several times over the last years, but they didn't. But they did it in the past. There were countless reports way before 2066 of people who got abducted and experimented on or vanished without a trace. Some were found later somewhere in the woods or on a mountain, sometimes with amnesia, but in most cases dead and often without a drop of blood. I don't think they eat us, but maybe they drink our blood or something because, I mean, they are still harvesting zombies. I've seen how they pull zombies into their crafts just with light. And they keep the zombies alive with Neuralink and all that on purpose to harvest them one day. There's definitely a plan for them behind that, you know. Overall, everything has to do with blood, it seems. In all wars, blood was spilled. All the bloodless alien victims, not only humans but also animals, all the blood sacrifices from the Aztecs and Mayas, as well as the modifications of human blood due to vaccinations with nanotechnology. Oh, and in church they drank Jesus' blood and ate his corpse. Well, not really his blood and body, but to say that it is blood and a part of his body, and that you would have to drink and eat it to be a good Christian, I don't know. That's always sounded odd to me, like from another planet, and maybe it was. However, since I have a lot of time thinking about everything, I already thought that maybe these aliens are the God the Bible mentions, or all gods, every religion ever mentioned. Maybe they are not here since 1947 AD, but since 1947 BC, or even longer. It could be because old scripts from the Egyptians and other long-gone civilizations suggested that. Maybe they were always here. Maybe they even were here before us, and maybe we were, or still are, just an experiment all along. I guess I'll never know. By the way, have you heard from the Georgia Guidestones? Nobody knew who erected them overnight in 1980 in Georgia, USA, but they stated that humanity should be maintained under 500 million people. Sadly, someone destroyed them in 2022. It could be that the aliens erected them. It could be. And if we are really still 500 million people, then the majority of us are zombies in cities, but I avoid cities because of the zombies, so I don't know for sure. But that there are much more zombies than people like me is very obvious. Maybe the aliens kindly cutted out 3 zeros from the 500 million for us as an extra punishment after we dropped atomic bombs on ourselves. I don't know. However, even those closest to the aliens, all those rich and wealthy people also were made into zombies, and so... Ah, shite. I see the camera is signaling that the batteries will die soon. It's blinking. I'd like to tell you much more. But for example, how especially the church suddenly was into preventing birth by allowing anti-baby pills and condoms and whatnot, which was completely against what they had preached hundreds of years, and therefore it's very suspicious when it comes to raise dumb humans with dumb beliefs, but there's no time left. One last thing, the climate change the people were so afraid of for decades never happened, at least not as we were told. As you can see, nothing is Damn! Look! There's a zombie. Do you see it? What's the zombie doing in the forest here? However, I'll continue my journey now. But I finally say, to be alone all the time is the worst torture. Humans are mammals and also herd animals. And to be alone all the time drives me crazy. But whenever I see another human, it's always just a zombie. Like the one there. And the only thing you can do to help these poor souls out of their misery is to kill them before they kill you. This is so sad. They'll never come back from their delusional state, and the sudden death will keep them from whatever horrible fate they would have after the aliens harvested them. And it will keep them from killing me, which is highly in my interest. However, I hopefully cross my path with a greater human colony in the nearer future to finally get settled down after almost 10 years of wandering. I'm so alone. I mean, I met just 2 other male non-zombies in almost 10 years, and one of them tried to kill me for my possessions and food, so I had to kill him first. As said, humans are dumb. But I'm still here, so I'm sometimes imagining myself as like the chosen one or Adam from the Bible, who will meet his Eve someday and then helping to repopulate this planet with fresh, healthy humans, you know. But I guess that's just another stupid dream from a stupid human. Because there's no conscious human left, it seems. And I'm getting too old for that shit. And then there are still the humans harvesting aliens, which are still a threat. But I don't give up. Not yet. And you shouldn't too. Never. This was Eric Labernich, signing off into an unknown future.